Okay, we are in chapter 14 of Echo. The 4th of July came and went without mention. The Saturday following after breakfast, Mike sat in the bedroom playing the harmonica while he and Frankie waited for Mr. Howard to take them to the park. Frankie got up from the floor where he'd been pencil drawing and went to the mirror above the dresser. Mike, do you think I need another haircut? Mike stopped playing and studied Frankie. Maybe in a few weeks, but you look fine for now. Do you think I'm too noisy? Frankie, no. Why? 'Cause everybody here likes us, except her. I've been leaving nosegays from the garden by her bedroom door and making pictures and leaving them at her place at the dining table. But she doesn't ever talk to us. So I was just thinking if Mr. Howard took me for a haircut, or if I was quieter, then maybe, he shrugged. Listen, like I tell you every day, she's just getting used to us. She wasn't expecting boys or two of anything, and it takes some folks longer than others to warm up. At least we're not at Bishop's and we're together, right? Frankie nodded. Right. You know, sometimes I feel guilty we have so many nice things now when so many other kids don't have anything, said Mike. You ever feel that way? Frankie nodded. I think about James and how he's still at Bishop's with shoes too small and I have new ones. Same here. I think about Mouse living on the streets and wonder what he's going to do when it gets cold, and here I have a bed full of blankets. I think about these things a lot, about how come it was us and not someone else got picked to come here. We're the lucky ones, kid. Frankie gave him a wobbly smile. Mike wished he believed his own words, but even though they had so much, too many things still didn't add up. And even though Mrs. Potter had said Mike would get used to things not making sense, after 3 weeks he hadn't, and that worried him. There was something big gnawing at him, a question far more confounding than a piano in the music room that sorely needed playing. Mrs. Potter appeared in the doorway. Mr. Howard is here. Frankie, let's get you cleaned up a bit. Is she coming with us? Asked Frankie. Mike looked at Mrs. Potter and caught the look of pity in her eyes and almost imperceptible shake of her head. She put on a smile. Not today, but lots of vendors are still in the park, being it's just after the holiday. You'll enjoy it. She took Frankie's hand and led him from the room. Mike heard voices from the open window. He stepped closer. Down below, Mrs. Sturbridge and Mr. Howard stood on the front walk. She was dressed for town in her usual black, carrying gloves and a handbag. Mr. Howard had his hands on his hips. You're going to see Golding today. Why don't you come with us? I'm trying to undo what's been done. They're good boys, Eunie, and talented. You'll see that if you gave them a chance. Whatever Mrs. Sturbridge said next was so quiet that Mike couldn't hear, but her gaze dropped to the ground. Mr. Howard shook his head. I know you've suffered, Eunie, but so have those boys. I'm sorry I put you in a situation that was far different from what you were expecting. I was doing my best, given that time was running out. You know all your father ever wanted was for this house to be filled with children and music and for you to open your heart again. She looked up at Mr. Howard. What good has opening my heart ever done? Everyone who matters to me leaves me. That's not true. I never left you. Not on the playground when you were a girl and lost your mother. Not when you married a man your father didn't approve of. I stayed at your side when little Henry and your father, he choked up and his voice cracked. I never left through all of it, and I'm still here. But if this is your way of telling me that I don't matter to you, then maybe it's time I move on. He turned and walked into the house. Her eyes followed him. She looked up and caught Mike watching her from the window. He felt the blood rush to his face. Would she be angry he was eavesdropping? She didn't look mad. She looked as if she might cry. Before he could blink, she spun around and strode to the Packard, where Mr. Potter held the door open. Mike watched the car pull away, more questions taunting him. What did her dead father have to do with their adoption? Who was Henry? And what was she trying to undo? Okay, let's keep going. As they walked toward the park, Mr. Howard didn't talk or whistle, and the spring in his step was gone. When they passed his house, Frankie asked, Have you ever climbed those trees? Mr. Howard shook his head. Not since I was a boy, but you boys can climb them any time you like. Mike won't ever, 'cause he's afraid of heights. Is that true, Mike? Mike nodded. I'm afraid of spiders, said Frankie. What are you afraid of, sir? Frankie, these days I'm afraid of losing everything I ever cared about. He looked from Frankie to Mike. And I'm afraid of losing the things I'm beginning to care about. Like us? Asked Frankie. Mr. Howard smiled, but looked sad, too. Mike felt a pang in his heart. You see, I had hoped that one day Eunie and I might. Mr. Howard frowned. Get married? Asked Frankie. Mr. Howard blushed. Even his freckles looked brighter. You love her? Asked Frankie. He flung out his hands. It might not matter any more. I have an opportunity with my firm to transfer to San Francisco at the end of the year. I haven't told them yes or no yet. Frankie took his hand. Please don't go. I can't promise to stay, he said. It depends on what happens here. Mike puzzled. What needed to happen for Mr. Howard to stay? As they approached the park, Frankie ran ahead and joined some boys playing ball. Mike and Mr. Howard sat on a bench. What would become of them if Mr. Howard left? There'd be no more Saturday outings, no more playing ball on the lawn, no more checkers after dinner. Without him around, the house would seem bigger, their lives emptier, especially since Mrs. Sturbridge barely spoke to them. Mike took a deep breath, the big question burning in his stomach. He forced himself to ask it. Mr. Howard, sir, how come Mrs. Sturbridge adopted us? We've hardly seen her since we got here. Even though we look presentable now, she still doesn't seem to want us. Mr. Howard took off his hat and stared at it as if it held all the answers. I guess it must feel that way. I suppose you're old enough to understand and have a right to know. You see, Michael, you and Frankie are her father's final wish. You mean when he was dying? Mr. Howard leaned back. Not exactly. You see, when Eunie was 20, she married a violinist she met in New York at a symphony benefit. He performed abroad for months at a time, so she lived in the big house with her father. Her husband came and went. A few years later, they had a son, Henry. That house became a different place with him toddling and then running around, so full of life and laughter and joy. He became the light of Eunie's and her father's lives. She and Mr. Dow spoiled him a little too much. In the young gentleman's department, remembered Mike. Where is Henry now? Against her wishes, Eunie's husband took him to a nearby lake one day. Henry was only 3 and couldn't swim. Her husband wasn't watching. He'd met some friends there and had his eyes on other things. And there was an accident. And Henry died. Suddenly, everything became clear. Mike whispered, That's why she didn't want to adopt a child, especially a boy. Mr. Howard stared into the park. She never forgave her husband. They stayed together for a few years, but he was rarely home, and soon he was squandering her money. They finally divorced. Then Eunie shut out the world. She hardly ever left the house. She still had her father, though, said Mike. Yes, for 5 years. He was in a wheelchair by then, polio. Taking care of him gave her some purpose. But as Mr. Dow grew frailer, he worried that Eunie would never have a family. All he wanted was for her to feel joy and love again. Secretly, he changed his will so that she would inherit his wealth only if she started proceedings to adopt a child within 1 year of his death, preferably a child who was musical. Otherwise, everything would go to charity, including the house. Eunie hadn't performed with an orchestra for years, so if she didn't oblige, she would have no income. Was she surprised? Asked Mike. That's putting it mildly. Angry, surprised, indignant, and sad that her father had died on top of it. At first, she said she wouldn't dishonor Henry's life by replacing him with another child. She tried to get the will changed, but her father was clever. It's almost ironclad. She put off adopting until the year deadline was only weeks away. That's when she sent me to choose a child for her, so she'd be within the law, to buy her more time. Mr. Howard looked at Mike apologetic. I thought our adoption was final. The papers have been filed, but they don't become legal until 3 months have passed. You were adopted the 2nd week of June. The 2nd week of September it will be said and done. Mike's stomach began to churn. So that's what she meant when she said, I'm trying to undo what's been done. That's why they'd hardly seen her. She didn't want to spend any time with them. She was trying to get rid of them. Mike, are you all right? Mike said slowly. So we were brought here so the lawyers could have an extra 3 months to figure out how she can unadopt us? Mr. Howard nervously rotated his hat around and around. I'm sorry. He put an arm on Mike's shoulder. Mike pulled away, choking out his words. How soon is she going to send us back? Just tell me, Mr. Howard. I have to know. Legally, she's only required to adopt one child. I suppose she could send you both back and start proceedings on another child. As long as the adoption process is underway, she meets the criteria, but that's not likely to happen. Mike felt as if he'd been scrambling up a cliff, but just as he reached the top, he slipped and fell to the bottom. So she could just keep adopting a different boy every 3 months until the waiting period is up and make him think he's going to live in a beautiful house, have good things to eat, and get nice clothes and spend time with you. And then when he gets his hopes up that something right is finally happening in his life, she will send him back to Bishop's. Mike, I don't think it will ever come to that. Mike's mind raced and his words tumbled. I gotta look out for Frankie. Bishop's won't be taking any lowers come September, and he just can't go to the state home. Kids die there. Mike clenched his fist. Why did you choose us if you knew? Maybe another family would have come along. Maybe a family who cared about us would have. He choked back a lump in his throat. Mike, listen to me. When I met you and Frankie, I knew immediately there was something special about you boys. I lost my own brother in the war, and I'd give anything to have him back. I couldn't separate you. That day at Bishop's, it became apparent that Mrs. Pennyweather intended to do just that. I figured if I brought you here, you and Frankie would be safely together for at least the summer and hopefully longer. Mike dropped his head. I knew it was too good to be true. Mr. Howard said quietly, It will all be good and true in the end. I'm hanging my hat on it. He blew out a long breath. You know, Mike, she wasn't always closed off and distant. Grief did that to her. She was a loving mother, and when she was with Henry, her happiness just spilled over. She can be quite wonderful, and so talented. She was a concert pianist, you know. When she walked out on stage, my heart and the whole world stood still. I admit that bringing you and Frankie here was a risk, but I still think it was the right thing. Can't we hope for the best? How could Mike hope for the best when the worst seemed so much more probable? He didn't answer. Mr. Howard sighed and patted Mike on the back. I would adopt you myself if the law allowed a single man to do such a thing, but it doesn't. He stood and walked to a vendor with a pushcart and came back with 3 good humor bars. He called to Frankie and waved him over. Frankie climbed up on the bench and grinned, his cheeks pink from playing. Thank you, Mr. Howard. He licked the dribbles from his ice cream bar as quickly as they melted. He looked up at Mike. You're not eating. What's wrong? Nothing, kid. Mike wasn't going to fill Frankie's mind with the prospect of the state home. Besides, it was his job to worry. Frankie finished and begged Mr. Howard to push him on a swing. Mike stayed on the bench, staring at the good humor bar, watching the chocolate slide from the vanilla center. He held it over the grass as it fell apart. First the shell, and then the insides. Okay, so this is kind of, that ice cream bar is a picture of his life kind of crumbling and falling apart. I want you to look at the last 3 questions on section 10 through 14. How does the blues relate to Mike and Frankie's life? So Mike is a good player. How can he play the blues so well? We talked about the blues being a mix of emotions. So how is Mike able to play so well? How does Mrs. Sturbridge behave around the boys, and how does that make them feel? Okay, so we talked about that at the beginning of the first chapter we read today. How does it make Frankie and Mike feel? And then what new information did you learn about Miss Sturbridge? Does that change your thoughts about her? What questions do you still have about her? Okay, now this is where I'd like to see your comments today. You can either give me a question that you have about her, Or you can tell me if your thoughts have changed about her. You can say, I used to think, but now I think. Okay. And give me an opinion. Or if you don't have any questions, give me some kind of an opinion about her. So I want your sentence, your comment today to be about Mrs. Sturbridge. Okay. Have a good day.